All right, we are live. Hey, folks, we're here with Uncle Bob. So I wanted to have the same framework discussion, Bob, that we had on JavaScript Jabber.
Yep.
I think our approach will be different because a lot of the framework discussion there was around like front end and trade-offs there, and here we're probably going to talk a lot more about Rails. So
Sure.
Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and just kick us off, and then we can just start talking. I think that's probably the best approach.
All right,
here goes. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Valentino Stoll.
Hey now.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. I just want to do a quick call out, aidevbootcamp.com. If you sign up within the next few weeks, I'm doing a 45% discount because I turned 45 on Saturday. And yeah, Bob's laughing. I'm going to take a little personal license here. So there's a political party. I'm in county leadership, and we were talking about youth outreach, and our party secretary is probably pretty close to Bob's age. And so we were chatting, and we had like this 22, 23-year-old young woman who was talking to us about reaching out to younger people. And somebody goes, so when we're talking about youth, who are we talking about? And he chimes in and he goes, anybody under 45. And so I felt young for like a week and a half, and then I turned 45. So anyway,
real now.
That's right. I'm old now. So anyway, we also have Uncle Bob Martin, or Robert C. Martin, as people know him. Bob, do you want to just say hello and let people know what you're up to these days?
Hi. Yeah. What am I up to these days? Well, I'm in the midst of writing the second edition of Clean Code. My publisher said, you should do a second edition. And I thought, that's probably a good idea. It's been about 16, 17 years.
Yeah.
So first draft is off to the publisher. They're going to send it out for review. Then we'll do another scan through it. And I imagine we'll see it out mid next year.
Good deal. You also released, and this came up on the JavaScript Jabber show, and I was excited for it. And so we're definitely going to have you back on this show and that show to talk about it. But you released another book about historical programmers.
We Programmers is the title of it. The publisher thought maybe We the Programmers was a little too much like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or something. So it's called We Programmers, which is a nice takeoff on Asimov's I, Robot, I suppose. Mm-hmm. It is a history of software programmers, starting with Babbage and then walking through the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century. So we get people like Dijkstra and Hilbert and von Neumann and Turing and Grace Hopper and John Bacchus and of course the C trio, Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson and Brian Kernighan. And I focus on the technology. Right? This is a book for programmers. So I talk about the machines themselves, how many bits they were, what were their cycle times, what did the instructions look like, what kind of problems were they solving, how much memory did they have, what kind of memory it was. And I also focus a lot on the personalities of the programmers, specifically their life struggles. Because all of these people were human, and they were really interesting humans. And they all had... in the midst of this really deep technological struggle, they also had very human struggles. So it's a book about the human side of programmers, but with enough technology to attract the attention of programmers. So that's how the book goes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me just from the standpoint of yeah, I mean, they're essentially doing what we do. The difference, I guess, is that, and this is the thing I like about good narratives, a novel or whatever anyway, is that, their challenges were different. They were inventing new ways of doing things. I guess the difference between some of the other books that I read in this is that we're, unless it's a historical novel like this or, has to do with the past, right? We're still dealing with some of these things, or we benefit from the way that they invented to solve them. So
it's easy to draw a line if you look at the technologies, and if you really dig into the technologies, it's easy to draw a line from there to here.
right.
And that line is this exponential curve, which we called Moore's law back before Moore's law died. But it's very interesting to you look at the early mechanical machines, and then the electromechanical machines, and then the vacuum tube machines, and then the transistor machines, and then the integrated circuit machines, and you can see this interesting curve. And the same thing happens with memory. Originally memory was just in gear positions, and then later on it was sound waves through tubes of mercury, and then it was charged dots on CRT screens, and then finally it was core memory, real core, magnetic core, and then finally, disks and solid state memory. So very, very interesting. And if you follow the deeper technology, you can see that thread really easy. And you can see the struggles of the hardware architects. They had no idea what programmers would mean. So the early machines had no way to call a subroutine, no way to store a return address, no way to put anything on a stack, right? The earliest machines had no jump instructions. They were just linear steps. And if you wanted to have a loop, you would take the paper tape, which drove the machine, and you would back it up, and then let it run forward, and then you'd back it up again.
Oh, no way.
Forward. Yeah. And the operators would have to check the registers to see whether or not the loop exit condition had been achieved. But, when you're only executing 10 instructions a second, you can do that. And, a good program will run for 80 hours with constant operator intervention.
Well, I have to say, I'm living a charmed life.
Yeah, here we are communicating over the ancestors of these machines, whipping bits around at a rather impressive rate.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yes, it is. Oh, yes. Exponential curves
cool. Yeah.
definitely have an effect over time.
Yeah. Anyway, it's great stuff. I actually invited you to come on and talk about, and it's this snippet. It's like, 3 minutes? But it was interesting. Taras on X says, so that's where rolling your own loop comes from.
Yes, they actually did do that. They would put the paper tape into a loop. They'd scotch tape it together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Except one time they twisted it, and then it was a Mabaya strip. Didn't execute well.
All right. Well, let's dive in. So this video. I don't know if you posted it or somebody clipped it from a talk you gave, but it's essentially
it from a talk. Yeah.
So
put background music in.
Yeah. And there's some images that show up, and there's a guy that's massaging his temples, right? And, anyway, it's the problem with frameworks. And what's interesting, because we had a similar-ish conversation on Ruby or on JavaScript Jabber, and so it'll come out probably around the same time as this one. What's interesting to me, though, is that you brought up Rails when we asked you about it, and then we totally sidebarred into React and Vue and and all the stuff there, and trade-offs with maybe Svelte or something like that. And the concerns that we're talking about, the things our frameworks do for us in Ruby are, I guess, some ways similar, but in a lot of ways it's solving different concerns and different problems. And so I was kind of curious to see if we would have the same conversation here, or if it'd be a bit different just from the standpoint, but just given the different technologies. So keeping that in mind, I just kind of want to kind of let it rip. What are the problems with frameworks, right? Because we all love ours.
It was Rails that actually put me on this track.
Okay.
Because I had been a tepid Rails programmer for a few years. Back when Rails was the big thing. I don't know what year that was. Probably 06 or something like that.
Yeah, about then. That's when I got into it.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I was diddling around with it, and I wrote a couple of applications for this or that. And then my son showed me an application that he had written, and I was just reading through it. And I noticed that just the directory structure of his application yelled at me. It just said, Rails, Rails, I'm using Rails. And I thought, well, that's odd. Why is his directory structure so damned opinionated? And, well, I mean, that's because Rails is an opinionated framework.
Right.
And that made me think, well, okay, should it be? Or rather, should I allow Rails's opinionation to influence the structure of my application? Or should I make sure that I keep the opinionated structure of Rails at arm's length? While I go ahead and use it, can I keep all those opinions from leaking into my application and warping my application? And that's really what got me onto the thread of frameworks. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, okay, David is the author of Rails, David Hannemeyer Hansen, and he did it for his company. He did it for 37 Signal, right? He did all that for him. He didn't do it for me. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, the more I commit to Rails, the more asymmetric this relationship becomes, because David is not making any commitment to me at all. He's not promising to maintain Rails in the direction I want it to go. He's not promising to give me any features that I want. He's going to put in features that he wants. And if I like them, fine. If I don't, I can get lost. And he actually put, he went to a conference at one point, and bunch of people at that conference, and up on the screen as he's standing there right behind him were two words. The first one started with F and the second one started with Y. And so I thought, yeah, I probably don't want to make a big commitment to an author who has no commitment to me. I don't mind using the stuff as long as I can kind of keep it at some kind of a distance, build a little isolation layer, and prevent myself from being polluted and trapped in the opinionated structure that he is properly creating for himself.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I'm just gonna kind of pile onto this idea a bit. Like if you go watch the last keynotes that David gave at, and when we say David is DHH, folks, for the people that aren't following along.
A guy I hold in very high regard, by the way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've known David now for several years, and so I call him David, and I don't anyway. But he, like, if you go watch the talks, right, he's talking about stuff that's terrific stuff, right? And it's like, oh, I want that. Oh, I love that. Oh, I really. But if you're paying attention to his talk, what he says is, hey, we're introducing this new thing, and here's the problem it solved for us at Basecamp, right? I mean, every single thing. And we had this problem at Basecamp, and we solved it with this, and now you can use it too, right? And granted, a lot of those are things that I want solved too, and so I'm perfectly happy to pick them up. But yeah, I mean, the truth is a lot of the stuff that ends up in Rails is stuff that they need, and then yeah, they do get contributions from other companies that have other concerns, and they'll accept those, right? But then it's solving some other person's problem that's contributing to the framework. But the vast majority of the stuff that he goes up and announces, he basically says it. This solved this problem for us at Basecamp.
Yeah, and that's great. It's just, maybe I can use that to solve my problem, and maybe there's a way that I can use it to solve my problem without making a gigantic commitment to it, without inheriting from some base class that they wrote, or without forcing my application to adopt the structure that they want.
Yeah, Rails magic. What do you think of Valentino?
So it's hard because the structure of the application, if you're a contractor, as an example, or a consultant, having that be the same for all of the applications that you have to look at is such a huge benefit,
It's
right?
true.
Like, and having a lot of the things normalized, maybe not everything that Rails normalizes, but like the normality across, like, just like if you're looking at hundreds of applications, right, throughout a year, like you just save incredible amount of time and context, right? Like you don't have to rethink, okay, well, Uncle Bob today decided to use a different, structure because, maybe that it was a more appropriate design decision, right? But it's different than maybe some of the other ones that, you more typically will take on. And so you have to then have to reframe your thinking and regain context. And there is kind of developer loss across that. But that's the trade-off, right? Like you make that choice upfront and it's your choice, right? So but I mean, thinking about bigger teams, like it becomes like really hard to like start, like where do you see, like in a larger team structure, like the value in like creating like the barrier to the framework, right? Like where do you start to see, okay, like we have started to design our pieces of the application separate from the framework. Like when does that start to take off, right? And where does that like really start to fit in the most obvious?
Well, I think that the first question that a team would face is, which framework should I use? Should I start with Rails? Because a lot of people do, right? They just say, okay, we're just doing Rails or whatever framework. It doesn't matter. I don't want to pick on Rails too much here. Just, there's whatever the framework du jour is, they'll say, okay, let's try that because it's beautiful and it's gorgeous and we can go really fast. And is that the right decision to make up front? Or should you be thinking about, all right, we've got this application and this application has a bunch of requirements and we're going to need this kind of data storage and we're going to need this kind of computational structure. And what framework out there would help us with this? And is there a framework out there that would help us with this? Or maybe what we should do is write a little bit of it, get a little bit of it going, and then see if there's a framework that fits into this. It would also be nice if the framework would be less demanding of commitment. Like, I'd like to use it off on the side. I'd like to call it a little bit. I'd like it to be more of a library than, forcing me to hand execution control over to it, and then it deigns to call me back when it needs to. I might want to maintain control of execution. I might, or I might let it go. But I'd like to be able to make those decisions with enough information that I can do so in an informed way.
So, and this is kind of where you begin to lose me a little bit, because I don't know how you do this. I mean, do you pick up something simple like Sinatra or Rhoda, or do you just start building the other pieces of your, maybe you build business logic, but I don't know. What's the approach here then to putting it off? Because Rails gives me, like Valentino said, it kind of gives me a bookshelf and tells me where to put my stuff.
Yeah.
And it solves a bunch of stuff out of the gate. And so, but at the same time, I really, it sounds right, especially, I kind of grew up programming under agile development and stuff, right? And you'll never know as little now or as little as you do now, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so if I can put it off and then realize, maybe Hanami or something else offers a different way to think about this that's more in line with what I want. But how do you do that? How do you start putting the pieces together without the framework then?
Well, so frameworks solve a particular problem, right? They help you get things on the screen. They help you get things onto a disk, into a database of some kind. They help you talk through sockets. There's a whole bunch of things that frameworks allow you to do. But then you've got your application, and your application has other things that it needs to do. There's a reason that your application exists. There are business rules that don't have anything to do with the framework. They don't have anything to do with what's on the screen or what's in the database. None of that technology matters to the reason that the application exists. Right? So you can create the core of an application. You can start with some business rules, and you can just put those together. It's not hard to do. There's some calculations you've got to do. There's perhaps some data storage you have to do. And you don't need to make a commitment to the screen or the database. You can build a little isolation layer that allows you to put things on a database, but without knowing what database it is, just a bunch of interfaces that you implement later. Yeah. And there's some way to get things on the screen. You don't know exactly how you're going to get it on the screen, but you can at least arrange the data in a way that you know would eventually get on the screen. And you can do all of that without the framework, you can do it without a database. You can do it without any of the normal kinds of trappings that you would expect in an application. And then when you've got enough of it done, and it doesn't have to be the whole thing, obviously, but when you've got enough of it done, you look at it and think, okay, what framework out there is really going to help me with this? I really need to get this on a web page. Maybe you haven't even thought about a web page yet, right? I really need to get this on a web page. And Rails is great at doing that. Maybe I should use Rails. But if I do use Rails, it would be really nice if I didn't have to pull all of that Railsy code into my application. Maybe I can put it all behind my isolation layer. And then I can call Rails happily through my isolation layer, and my application is not necessarily affected by Rails. This is the way I like to start all applications. I like to start with the business rules first, and then start feeling outwards and see how much of a framework I need. In the last one, I told the story of fitness. Mm-hmm. And in fitness, that was a web application. It's a wiki. And it's got a database, or at least we thought it would have a database. And as we planned the whole thing out, we thought, well, we're going to need a web server, and there's a couple of open source web servers you could get, and didn't have a big framework in those days. But, the GNU project had a bunch of, I think Apache had some web servers back in 2000 when we started this. And we thought, maybe we'll get a database, and we thought we'd get MySQL, because, why wouldn't you? And then we just started building, but without any of that stuff. We just started building. And what do you do with a wiki? The first thing you do is translate wiki text into HTML. Well, okay, that's pretty simple. You don't even need a web page for that. If you don't need a web server for that, all you need to do is look at the HTML. And if you want to get it up on a web page, it's awfully simple to get a browser and have it, pull up some HTML from a flat file or something. So that was very simple. And at some point we thought, well, we've got to get it up. We got to talk to a browser. We've got to be able to talk to a browser. Something's got to serve these web pages that we're building. And we thought, well, let's go look at the Apache thing. And then we thought, well, how hard is it to build a web server? Well, it turns out that's about 300 lines of code. It's not very hard to serve a web page. Just really all you're doing is opening up a socket,
right,
and throwing stuff out the socket. And we thought, well, why don't we just do that for the time being? Maybe we'll get Apache in there later, but for the time being, we've got 300 lines of code, and it puts up web pages. It's just fine. And we kept on working on translating the markup. Eventually, we needed a database, and we thought, well, we could get MySQL going, but it'd be awfully simple to just store all these pages in a hash table. And that kind of looks like a database from the outside looking in. You can make calls against a hash table that look like a database query. So we built a little interface that looked like a database query and put a hash table behind it, and kept on working and working and working. Got the whole doggone program up and running, the whole wiki and all of the stuff that it was doing. With lots of extra stuff that we were doing in fitness. And we didn't have a database, and we had our own little tiny web server. And then we thought, well, we got to get this stuff on disk somehow, because we can't just keep it in a hash table. And Michael Feathers was there at the time, and he just wrote a little thing that dumped it all out to a flat file. And now we had persistence. We didn't use MySQL for the persistence, and we didn't use Apache for the web server. And we put the whole doggone thing together. It sits in one jar file, and just turned it loose. And people were using it and using it. I think it's still got a fairly significant user base today after 25 years. So that's a story of how I like to build from the inside out and feel my way towards the outside world.
Yeah, it's funny you mention it like that, because I feel like from a Rails developer standpoint, it's like backwards, where
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure, like
backwards.
you think about even just like the small design decisions where people, you'll create a service object, which is just a class that like does one responsibility, but it's really like you have this design as a thing because like you have to do something separate from the framework, and there's form objects and all these different kind of objects that people have come up with to augment what they to make their own thing, kind of like to make a pattern out of like something, because almost like the framework is so like opinionated, you want to make opinionated patterns, and so it does have like kind of that translating effect. But I like your thinking of like boundaries for sure.
Yeah.
I think like creating boundaries is like super important from like an application, like focusing on what like you're actually delivering for your users. That's unique, right? And like it's funny because like there's a Ruby gem called Packwork, designed by Shopify. And if you haven't heard, it's like a way of just like creating those boundaries in isolation within a Rails system, right? So it's like something that was created to snap into a Rails thing to isolate it from Rails, which is just a little bit funny because we're working backwards, and it's super funny to me because like this all comes from like everything in Rails is built on Rack, which is like honestly a really great design framework.
Oh yeah,
because it has like at this bare minimum is just like individual modules that you can drop or not, right? And you can add and stack on however many you want, and all of those individual pieces like mutate or adjust the stack that it's in individually and in isolation, and so it's easy to test, easy to swap in and out, and I really like the design of Rack personally as a framework because it is like super modular, which is funny because Rails is termed supposed to be modular, and in a lot of ways it is. You can start removing, if you don't want active record for database, you don't have to use it. You don't have to just like use all the standards, and it's funny because like that was a common practice in the early days of like even Groupon, right? Like you would just like you have your Rails stack like explicitly defined in your setup and say, oh yeah, I'm going to use all of these things all the time. And now it's just like, well, we were just going to require Rails and be done with it. And so it has kind of moved away from that. But I'm curious, like, when you're thinking about like, yeah, I just want to write something to disk, and that works, and that's fine. Like, let's say like something became super popular, and you started to have like a lot of people working on it and having to like get up to speed with all these individual like customizations. Like at what point, where's the diminishing return there, right? Like where is it like, okay, we built all these custom things that people have to manage over time and make sure are secure and things like that. Like where do you stop? Like, do you go down and like build compiler code? Like, what is your reasoning on like, what is something worth like implementing custom versus like just adopt it in the framework?
Well, a lot of it is control. How much control do I have over the parts of my system? And if I surrender to a database plugin of some kind, like MySQL or something else, I lose control over that. And that's now under somebody else's control. And I am a, I don't want to say I'm a slave, but I am subject to the whims of whatever they do. And that bothers me. So I want to put a little isolation in there. Now, I'm not going to rewrite a compiler. I don't need a new language. I trust that the language is not going to do stupid things. And that's not always a good trust. I mean, I left C++, And I left Java eventually too, because standards committees, as soon as a language gets into a standards committee, I think the end is in sight, because they're just going to keep on going and going and going and adding more and more deluged crap into the language. And at some point you have to get a simpler language. But for fitness example, going back to the fitness example, we chose Java as the language because it was kind of the obvious choice in the day. And it's still all written in Java, and it's fine. Everybody's happy with it. Okay, great. But I'm not going to do another big project in Java. No, because it's way out of control at this point. So I look at that and think, I want to keep control over as much of this system as I can and relinquish as little control as possible. And I can do that by trusting the vendors that I get, like the Java language, and then building isolation barriers to all of the things I don't trust.
Interesting.
I don't know if that answered your question.
I guess so. I guess my concern with like anything custom is maintenance costs, right? Like, and so like that's the first thing I think about anytime I create something new that isn't like just some standard thing that most people know. And so like
one of the great things that happened to us with fitness was that the amount of code that we had to invest in these things that you would normally do with a framework was minimal. I mean, the maintenance costs were almost non-existent. We didn't need, and in the end, we didn't need a relational database. We didn't know that up front. We thought we would need one. In the end, we didn't need one. And what does it take to take a hash table and dump it out to flat files? It's, not a lot of code. We didn't need a web server because we put one together, 300 lines of code. It's not a lot to maintain there. So one of the things that I've found is that if I'm careful about making these framework-like decisions, I may be able to replace the bulk of a framework with something much simpler that's easier to maintain than the framework is.
So I'm just trying to think here then, because somebody could listen to this and be forgiven for thinking, oh, so Bob's advocating that maybe we don't use frameworks.
Yeah, no, that's not what I'm advocating.
Right. So my question then is, okay, so at what point do you consider adopting a framework? Because as you said before, a lot of times people go in and it's like, I need a new web thingy that does whatever it is that I need done. And we use Rails for everything else here, so we're just going to stamp Rails on it and go. And you're advocating for maybe a more measured approach where you solve some of the other problems first.
Yeah.
So at what point in this life cycle do I go, oh, well, maybe I do need a framework, or maybe I don't need a framework?
There's several decision points there, right? So number one is you've got a little bit of an application going. You haven't invested in a framework yet. You've got a few business rules cooking. And then you think, all right, I need something to help me with X, whatever X is. Might be putting things in the database, might be getting things on the screen, might be pushing things out to a service, whatever X is. I need help with this X thing. And the first thing I would do is look at, well, how hard is this X thing to do myself?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's easy enough to do myself, like writing a hash table out to a flat file, well, I'm going to do that first. Now, my supposition there is that won't last. And that, by the way, that's the way we felt about the fitness decision. We thought that the writing it out to a flat file was a stopgap. We thought we would still go to a relational database. We just never did. So that's the first thing, is I would see, okay, is there some way I can get close to this X thing that I need by doing something myself, something simple, something really stupidly simple, and that'll give me more time. And I might have to go to a framework to solve X, or maybe not. Now, at some point you think, okay, I I got to get to the framework. I did this recently with another application I was working on. I was trying to stay away from a GUI framework, and I didn't want to do it. I didn't want it. And then in the end, I thought, okay, I just can't deal with all the little editing fields and the double clicking and the cursor blinking and all that stuff. I don't want to have to write all that code myself. I'm just going to have to use a GUI framework. And unfortunately, I picked the wrong one. I picked Swing. And so now I'm in a pickle. And I have to get rid of Swing, tear it out of there, and replace it with something else. But you do, eventually you face that, right? That there's this point where X, you can't do X yourself. So now you've got two options. You know you're going to have to use a framework. Do you commit to the framework and live with it forever, or do you isolate yourself from the framework? The mistake I made with Swing is that I did not properly isolate myself from Swing, because Swing is not an isolatable framework. If you use Swing, you have to commit to it. And so I committed to it, and now I'm in a pickle. I've got to dump it and throw it away. But sometimes you can take a step into a framework, but keep it isolated enough so that you can feel it out and defer the commitment. Use it, but defer the commitment for a while. And you may find that that's sufficient, or you may in the end just say, no, there's no way I can do this without making a commitment. And I understand the cost and the risk of making the commitment, but it's worth it. And that's the chain of decision making that I wish people would make. What I see people do is say, man, we got this new application to do. Let's fire up Rails.
Guilty.
Okay.
I do that.
Maybe that's not the first decision to make.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of this though, like it's hard. So the whole like premise of like DHH and the one person framework and Rails is like the core principle is, you know, as he states, conceptual compression, right? Like basically hiding away all the details that most people won't have to know, so they don't have to know it. And so like, because I know like, especially as you're early on coding, even middle, right? Like it's hard to create abstractions, right? Like it's hard to choose the right naming, choose the right communication layers, right? And so like these are very hard like design problems and challenges that most people will face. And it is easy to make a mess, right? Like if you start, especially if you start from nothing, right? Like you could very easily, okay, I'm just going to make like, I'm going to start with just like a command line application, and it's one script and it has 5 lines, and it's just going to like output standard out, right? And like, that's the application. And like, next thing you know, you have like, you know, 1,000 lines of code that's all like, you know, entangled, and like, you know, it's very easy to blow things up. And so like where, like at what point do you like, where do you like recommend people like to look for like building better abstractions, and like how to like make these design choices? Like it's, you know, you don't want to end up basically like designing up front too much too, right? Like how do you find that balance?
Well, I've been writing code for, you know, well over 50 years. So for me, the creation of abstractions.
I think he just said he's been coding longer than we've been breathing, Valentino.
Collectively?
Not collectively. I told you I'm 45, but
yeah. Well, so, you know, creating abstractions for me is a relatively simple thing. I can envision the system in my mind and see where all the pieces are and figure out the abstraction. It's not very difficult for me. I can imagine, however, that people who are much newer to programming find that to be something of a challenge. I remember that I certainly did when I was in my 20s, right? You know, made a lot of mistakes. And how do you deal with that? You get some old people on your team is what you do. You get some guys who know what they're doing, and you have them be the team leaders, and you know, then you know, they can be the foreman, and they can say, okay, guys, you know, we don't need to rush. Yes, the framework is fancy and it's very nice, but let's try this one little thing first. See if we can see if we can
Is there-
move slowly. And
Is there any
and-
wisdom you can impart here on like maybe like what your thinking is when you're like trying to like let's say like you have a task at hand that you have this problem you're trying to solve, like what's the first thing you start to do to maybe tease out what the abstractions are and how to model things?
So there's a frame of mind that I like to put myself into, which is to find the underlying abstraction. And to find the underlying abstraction, you have to divorce the whole problem from detail. So you have to enumerate all the details. Now, the details are all enumerated in the requirements. When you get a bunch of requirements, what you are getting is a load of details, because that's what all the marketing people and all the business people are all writing down the details. And you have to look at this and you have to go, okay, all these details are driving at something else, something core. And so you, one by one, you subtract out the details and you envision where this thing is actually trying to go. So they'll give you a whole bunch of wireframes. And the supposition, of course, is that this is going to be on a screen and it's probably on the web. And they've got, Webby-like buttons, and they've got Webby-like scroll bars and dialog boxes that would come up on a web. And the requirements just look like it's web. And then you say, okay, get rid of all these details. What is really going on in here? Bit by bit, you rip away the details one by one, and then you stare at what's left over. And if you can describe the purpose of the application without using any of the detail words, like, the web page or the dialog box or the button or clicking or dragging, if you can say what this application does without mentioning any of those details, then you are close to the underlying abstraction. And then at that point, you can start building back up. Say, okay, now I get it. Now I know what this application is actually doing. I know the core loop. I know what the steps are inside. And now I can start to build it. And, maybe it shouldn't go on a web page. Maybe it should go on something else. And maybe we shouldn't store the data in Oracle. maybe it should go somewhere else. Maybe this core idea is better implemented with a different set of details. But you can't get there until you've gotten rid of all those details. And that just takes will and effort, right? To just stare at the problem and reduce it down to the barest bones, and then reinflate it, but reinflate it in a direction that is better for everybody.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I think you also one thing, well, you kind of said it when you started, but it's like when I'm helping my kids with their math homework, Valentino asked, well, how do you tease out those abstractions? And you said, well, I've been programming for 50 years. And, I help my kids with their math problems, right? I'll look at it and I'll say, that's wrong, right? And they're like, well, how did you figure that out so fast? Well, I've been doing math for a really long time, and I've done it lots and lots of times. And so I think a lot of this is also just getting in and solving these kinds of problems and doing a whole bunch of this dirty work and figuring out, oh, okay, when I see this, it means this. You start doing some of that mental pattern matching because you've done it so many times, right? And so I think there's a lot there. But yeah, I love the approach that you outlined, because a lot of times it's just down to grit and moving away from those abstractions. Now I have to say that that you get the wireframe and all that stuff. I need you to come and explain to the clients that I often work with that the application is not the wireframe. Because I'll tell you, when I show up to a stand-up meeting or a demo meeting, they want to see all of the stuff that you told me to ignore.
Yep.
And so how do you balance this, right? How do you balance out okay, this is an app that does X, Y, and Z, right? Like right now, I'm working on an app that tracks transactions and does a whole bunch of math for hedge funds, right? At its core, right? But if they don't see the stuff on the screen, then they aren't happy people. And so, how do you balance that out?
Well,
Right? Because they want the Rails stuff, that right? All that stuff that I got from my framework. They want it now.
well, yeah, they think they want it because that's how they envision it.
Right.
Right. They have a vision of it, and they're envisioning it that way, which is fine. And one of the ways you can do that is to give them glimpses. So, for example, one of the things that we did long ago is we used Fitness. Fitness is a an acceptance testing framework, right? So you enter data into tables, and it'll send that data into your application, and then it will compare that with the results that are in the table as well, and see if you pass or fail. So you pose a test as a set of table data. And what's interesting about that is that since it's a wiki, you can change the data in the table. So a very nice thing to do for marketing people and users is to give them an interface like that, where all the calculations are being done. And then you give them a simple interface, something like Fitness or something else, doesn't really matter, and let them fiddle. And they can see the actual business rules executing, which is really what they want to see. They want to see the business rules executing, right? They understand that if the form is a little different, it doesn't matter. They want to see the business rules executing. They gave you wireframes because they thought that was the best way. They also have another viewpoint, which is the customer outward-looking viewpoint. They think that these wireframes are the best way to communicate with the customer.
Yes.
Fine. But let's make sure that we're doing the calculations correctly first. And we'll just put it up on some dumb little thing. We don't have to invest in a horrible framework. We can just toss it up and look at it, and you can fiddle with it and play with it and see if we're doing that part right. Because let's get that part right first, and then we can figure out how to get it up on the screen with all the drag and drop GUI stuff. And maybe by then your ideas will change about how that ought to look to the customer. One of the things about details is that details are the things that change. The core business rules don't, or they don't very much. But all those all those details, all those things that are on the wireframes, all those things that are in the requirements, they are the things that change the most frequently. So you want to kind of get them outside of the core, so the core can remain safe from the volatility out here.
Right. This kind of reminds me of the talk. I'll have to go find it, but I think it was Gary Bernhardt that talked about having he talked about having the core of his app, and then he had all the and I think somebody else talked about some of the similar ideas with like hexagonal architecture and things like that. So,
it's all part of it. All these architectures, they all have the same general idea: a hexagonal architecture, clean architecture, ports and adapters. All of them have the same basic idea, right? Get the details out here because they're volatile. Get the business rules in here because they're not volatile. Right. And these are the family jewels here. You want those right. Everything else out here, well, you can fiddle with that.
Yeah.
So I want to quickly talk about framework speed, right? Like one of the biggest selling points of using a framework is just like speed of development, right? Because you have all these normalizations, everybody's familiar with all the things, and you can tie into all the framework things that they, they're opinionated, just go with the opinions, and you can skip a lot of steps. So like, how can we start to like simultaneously create the barriers without reducing that speed? Or like, how can we keep up the speed at the same time? Like, at what point do you say, I mean, obviously for like the business rules, it makes sense to slow down because those are the most important. But I mean, next to that, like once you have those like isolated and resolved, like at what points do you make those trade-offs to slow down?
Well, okay, you're saying something there that I'm not quite sure is the premise is correct. Like slowing down. So I don't think there's a problem with using a framework as long as you can touch it lightly. right? So let's say that you've got some business rules and you think they're pretty good, and you want to get those up on a screen, and you don't want to invest in writing your own screen stuff. So you think, okay, I'll use this framework, but I'm going to use the framework lightly. I'm not going to dive in and do every fancy thing that the framework is allowing me to do. I'm going to just get some dumb stuff on the screen without a lot of nonsense for the moment. Now, that doesn't take you a lot of time. It's not going to stop you. It's not going to slow you down, right? It's going to give you and your customers information that they can then use to take the next step. And at the next step, you think, well, that next step is probably going to make me do a bigger commitment to the framework. Is there some way I can isolate myself, or do I just have to decide to make the commitment to the framework and live with that commitment?
Let me share an example of of a slowdown from isolation, right? Like, so let's say somebody has a task and they wanted to create a quick store. They didn't want to use Active Record. They didn't want to store in a database. Completely understandable. And basically what they've built starts to evolve into a more complex storage solution where it starts to be more complicated to understand, as an example, right? Like, let's say they're storing everything as a hash and, you have to have multi-dimensions in the hash to make sense of the data that's relational. And it starts to become more complex for other people to come in and understand it rather than just like a single person. So that's just like one small example of like a slowdown, right? It's like creating some unfamiliar territory in an abstraction that at the time was maybe a good choice, but has evolved to something that now is more complicated. Like, I know for you, it's probably easy to see that, oh, like this is taking on too much at a certain point in your abstraction, right? So how do you surface these things across your team, right? Like, is it just like peer review is enough, or are there like planning steps that you take to prevent it?
Well, peer review would be a good thing to do, especially if you've got some experienced people on the team. Better than peer review would be pair programming, right? So if you've got an experienced guy and he sits down with a younger guy, and the younger guy has been doing this clever little data thing, look, I didn't use a database. I did this instead. I'm using name value pairs everywhere, and it's just so cool. And the experienced guy sits down with that and says, yeah, that is pretty cool. Now let me tell you what bad thing's going to happen to you because you were doing that. And let's see if we can construct an interface between what you've done and what the application is, so that in the event that we need to get away from your clever little name value pairs, we can actually use a different structure. This is architect level stuff, right? Somebody who is, they've got 10 years of experience, 15 years of experience, and they can look at what is going on and say, yeah, we need to protect ourselves and rearrange this a little bit. Most of the questions you've fired at me are, I could rephrase as, how do I deal with the fact that everybody here is under 25? Okay. And there's just no good way to do that. It's important to have people on the team that are experienced enough to prevent the problems. Now, one of the problems with making the commitment, because at some point you may have to decide, I'm going to commit to this framework. I'm going to live with that. But one of the things you need to be able to foresee when you make that commitment is just what kind of an impediment the framework is going to be. What things, now that you've made the commitment, what things is it going to work against me at? What things will it prevent me from doing? And that's a significant issue, because as applications grow and as they get more complicated, the initial help that the framework gives you will often turn into a drag, something that slows you down. And then now you've made the commitment, you're going to be slow. And the more you want to do with it, the slower you're going to get, because it's fighting you at every turn. The opinions of the framework are no longer the opinions of the application, but you're stuck with the opinions of the framework. So when you make that decision to commit, make sure you're looking ahead far enough so that it's like, okay, this application really is going to go in the direction of the framework for the next 5 years, and we're not going to run into any of these impediments. That's a tough decision to make. Again, that takes somebody with a few years experience.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, because you're talking about this, and this kind of came to mind. I don't know if it makes the point perfectly, but it illustrates it to a certain degree. So, like I said, I'm working on this application that manages a hedge fund, and so when you import transactions into it from another system, through a CSV or some third-party API, it has to recalculate basically the balance sheet for the hedge fund. And at a certain point, they were using all the Railsisms in the app, and it was super slow. It took forever to calculate all those calculations, right? To work through all the transactions, and because it had to tally stuff at each transaction. And so I started looking at it and started working with it, and realized that I could do a lot of the work in the database, right? So I was moving out of the framework. The problem that I ran into was that Rails, it does give you this nice interface to say, here's a SQL string, do stuff. But then I was in this world of, I've got this really complicated SQL string that I've got to manage, and the framework didn't really help me with it at all. And then also figured out that a lot of the stuff I wanted to do was with just common table expressions, which is a feature in PostgreSQL, and that it had been brought into later versions of the framework. So now all of a sudden, if I want to use this version, I've got to update, and I've got to adopt all the other things to get to the newer version. And so that's where some of this stuff came to light for me, right? And so there's all kinds of other stuff that I am doing super fast because I'm so familiar with Rails, right? And I think, just to point it out, we're not bagging on frameworks. We're just saying there are trade-offs you have to make if you're going to use them. And so in this case now, yeah, I'm making another commitment to another version, and I have to take on everything else that comes with the new version of the framework. So, yeah, you guys are real quiet, like I either said something brilliant or dumb.
You stated an undeniable truth. That does happen. Yeah. And I've seen that kind of thing happen more than one time, where you get involved with a framework and it's great for the first 3 months. And then the next 3 months is like, and then the 3 months after that is like hell.
Yeah. but in this case, it's not in my way. It just doesn't offer what I need. And in order to get what I think I need, I've got to make another commitment.
Yes. Yeah. And rearrange a bunch of stuff. So then you've got to solve 3 problems.
That has nothing to do with what I'm trying to get. Yeah.
This brings up a great point about dependency management, right? And like taking on new dependencies in general, like obviously has to be weighed, but like I guess my biggest thing that I still struggle with is, how do you say something that you're trying to integrate and use just because you don't understand how it all works, and it's going to take too much time to tease that apart, right? Like, I don't build rockets. I'm not going to buy a rocket engine and take it apart and like replace something, right? Because it's going to take too much time to learn all that stuff, right?
Yep.
So, and sometimes using a dependency affords you that ability, right? And it's a great tool to use. So, I guess what I'm getting at is like, how do you weigh those things when you're trying to reason about the framework? In that this framework is great to use because it solves these things that I don't have time to reason about. Like, do you weigh that as part of your design choices, or do you try and just focus on where your limits are first and then circle back to the framework? Where's the cutoff?
Where's the cutoff? Well, obviously this is a judgment call, and the judgment requires some experience. But, if I'm going to embark upon a real simple app, and I know it's simple, and I know it's not going to be, and it's not going to grow over the years. It's just going to be a nice, simple little thing. and there's a framework out there that just does that, I'm going to use that framework. I'm going to make a commitment to the framework. I'm going to use it. And okay, I'm pretty sure that application is not going to grow. I could get burned by that decision, but it's not going to grow. It's fine. And 9 times out of 10, that'll be the right choice. Then you come up with another application. This application, the guys asking for this are serious. They're looking 10 years down the line, and they want some significant stuff done. And so then you think, okay, I could get the first year going and really easy with the framework, and then after that, there'd probably be hell to pay. That might be the right decision. Might be the right decision because you've got time to market issues and startup issues and stuff like that. But it might not be the right decision. It's worth thinking about that one. It's worth saying, okay, maybe there's a shorter path to get to a high value first release without making a commitment to something that is going to really hurt me a year or two down the line. Now, again, that's just all judgment call. But the first thing you want to do is make that judgment call. Put it in your head that you're going to make the judgment call, and then you're going to have to live with it. The thing you don't want to do is just say, yep, we're going to the framework. No thought, just beep, framework. That's what you don't want to do.
Yeah.
Make the decision.
To follow that up, are there things in frameworks that lead you there, right? Like, are you looking at problems and being like, yeah, this framework would be perfect for this thing because of X, right? Like, are there obvious draws to you for, some frameworks for some purposes?
Well, sure. I mean, the demo applications are often very evocative. So you look at the demos and you think, oh yeah, it's exactly what I want to do. And I don't think I'm ever going to want to do more than that. Why wouldn't I use the framework? Of course, I'm going to use the framework at that point. Once I've been a little bit careful about it, it's okay. A good thing to do with frameworks, you guys, this doesn't apply to you guys, but a good thing to do with frameworks is just to get a framework and write a dumb app, just so that how easy or hard it is for that first puncture. And then you can that'll help you make some decisions as well. You guys are long past that, but some people who are new and thinking, let's just get whip-de-doo framework out here and it'll just be perfect. Write a couple of apps, little things, just throwaway apps, just so that you know.
Yeah, I was going to say, essentially the point that I think both of you are making is knowing that you're going to have to make this judgment call at some point, right? Whether or not to pick up a framework or a particular framework. Yeah, you can take steps to say, what do I need to know in order to make the right decision? And so then it gets into, what do I need to know about the framework? What do I need to understand about my application and the problems I'm trying to solve? And then you can kind of get them to, okay, I got this point of information and this point of information, and I still need a little bit more information here. And right. So then you start getting closer to being able to make a decision one way or the other. And the decision may be not yet.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I was semi-hopeful with all of these new AI generator things. Like, as an example, Bolt.new, right? Like, you just say, you give them all the requirements, and then they just can help get your demo app ready. Obviously, there are some dangers there, long-term vision-wise, as we've outlined here. Are there any, is there any path to something in the middle there that can help you get and gather the requirements to the more modular steps that you need to take rather than all at once kind of thing?
So the application that I've been working on for the last couple of years is it's a browser for a social network. And I started on this and I thought, okay, I really don't want to get a GUI framework in here. So I found some dumb little thing helps me do graphics on the screen. It's really low level, like I can put a dot here, I can put a character there. It doesn't have any dialogue boxes or editing or anything like that. It's just really bare bones. And I started using that. And, I was able to get some stuff on the screen, but the problems that I needed to solve were not getting things on the screen. The problems I needed to solve were all these WebSocket things. I had dozens of WebSockets, and I had to be able to turn them on and turn them off. And I needed to be able to unpack and pack these packets. And there was all kinds of cryptography gunk going on. So I spent a lot of time on that. And then I could get, a couple of words on the screen. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. I'm actually receiving messages, and I can send messages. And oh, look at that. And then I needed to edit them. And, editing stuff on the screen, that's a nightmare. I did not want to write, inside Macintosh again. I did not want to write the whole GUI framework. And that's when I chose Swing. I made this decision, and it was the decision to commit. And I made it based on the fact that a lot of other apps had committed to Swing. Okay, it's probably okay. I can commit to Swing. I already had the guts of it, right? I had all the WebSocket stuff, and I had all the fancy decryption, and all that stuff was going on. I just needed to bolt Swing on. And I had a nice isolation barrier. I thought, okay, I can probably slip this in. No, there's just no way. Swing is just so horribly opinionated. And I've fought through that for a year. Just made the wrong choice, wrong judgment call. Okay, I just can't go on with this application. I'm going to have to rip Swing out and replace it with something better. And that's going to happen to all of us. We are all going to make the wrong judgment call and find out about it a year later. That's just the way software is. And okay, you've got to kind of look at that with clear eyes and realize, okay, I'm going to make this call, and I hope it works out. It might not. But don't make the call frivolously. Right? So just use the amount of information you got, solve. There's an old saying, and it comes out of, God, where was it? I think it was The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Anyway, do you ever read that book?
That's a great book.
Yeah, it's a great book. Let me tell you a little story about that one before. But in that book, there is a quote. And the quote is, when faced with something you don't understand, do any part of it you do understand, and then look at the overall problem again. Right? Which is just the basic incrementalism step, right? Break it into increments. Don't leap into the whole thing. Break it into increments. Solve little bits that you do understand or that you have a chance of understanding. And then you can look outward a little bit. And it'll look different.
Yeah, great advice.
Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to push us to picks.
Yeah, okay.
And this has been so good. Yeah, Valentino, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, all my picks today, I have some awesome coworkers, and they've been releasing some open source stuff. So I wanted to share what they've been working on because it's pretty fun stuff. The first one comes from my coworker Jordan. He created this gem called Reprise, and actually uses Rust to make performant schedules. So like if you use a gem called Ice Cube or something like this, it lets you like define ranges and have like a schedule object that can iterate over things really quickly. And he built it using like a Rust toolkit that snaps in to the Ruby subsystem called Magnus, which is pretty sweet to solve this specific problem. Really cool gem. The other one is my coworker David. He created this repo a long time ago called Octo. That's like a knowledge management app that you run locally on your system, and it's just like really fully featured. It has end-to-end encryption support and is cross-platform and has all kinds of crazy support in there. And you can think of it kind of like Obsidian or something like that. but fully open source. And the last one is something I haven't gotten to play with yet, but my coworker Rob, he created this thing called Cambion, and it's basically a way to configure Kamal and set it up really easily on Ubuntu and Debian systems. So it's like a configuration tool for Kamal to just make it easy. So that's really neat as well.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna jump into mine. Some of those I'm gonna go try out, by the way. It's like, oh, I'm working on that. So the first one I'm gonna pick, I always do a board game. The one that I've been playing with my friends lately is Heat. And it's a racing game. So your marker on the board is a race car. The car goes around the track. At different points, you get to a curve. And if you take the curve too fast, right? So if it's like a two curve, and the way you move is you put down cards face down. Everybody does this at the same time. And then you just go from the front of the pack to the back. And everybody flips their cards over and then moves however many they put down. And there are some factors in it that'll make you go faster or slower, right? You can put one down that you flip cards until you get, a card with the mark on it, and then you go that many. So if you go around the curve too fast, then you take on that much heat. So if it's a 2 curve and you go 6, you take on 4 heat. If you run out of heat in your engine, then you spin out, and you basically have to go back to the curve and take the curve at a decent speed. And at that point, you can't go over because you're out of heat in your engine. There are ways to cool off. A lot of catch-up mechanisms that made it a lot of fun. But yeah, I mean that's essentially the crux of the game, right? And you can draft and then pass other cars. You can, there are other rules, and there are like 4 or 5 racetracks or game boards that come in the game. It's really, really fun. Board Game Geek weights it at 2.19, which is, it has enough going on to be interesting. But a casual gamer wouldn't, play it and then say, this is way too complicated. So I'm going to pick that. I'm going to put the links to it, the Board Game Geek, and then Amazon links into the chat here. And then I've got a couple of books that I read. I actually listened to them on Audible. One of them is Hit Refresh by Satya Nadella. Satya is the CEO of Microsoft. And he basically, so the book is a little bit, I don't want to say it's like dated, but it's not up to like 2024. And so it ends, in the late 20-teens, maybe around 2020. And so he talks about basically him taking over Microsoft and then kind of leading it into this new age with cloud and stuff like that. And talks about his background and stuff like that. It is really, really good. I really enjoyed it. The other one that I listened to, and this is also a company kind of takeover turnaround book, is American Icon by Bryce Hoffman. And this one is the turnaround of Ford Motor Company. And Bryce Hoffman, so Hit Refresh is an autobiography-ish. Satya is the primary author. American Icon, he's an industry journalist, I guess. And so he got a lot of the inside track from a lot of the people in Ford and then wrote the book. And anyway, it was really fascinating just to listen through, this is how we solved this and this is how we solved that. And it goes through the recession in 2008. And, some of the deals they were trying to work out with the government, which I'll admit I don't love corporate welfare from the government, but it was interesting to see the approaches and how they dealt with people and how they did all this stuff. So I'm going to pick that. And then lastly, I think I might have mentioned a few times that I am running on Ubuntu now. I bought a desktop. the place I got to, so my laptop, when I'd run Docker and run the stuff for any of my clients, my laptop would just slow way down. And I was starting to get into AI, and that would slow it way down too. And so I decided I needed a newer machine. And so I started looking within the Mac ecosystem, decided pretty quickly that what I needed was not a laptop. And so I looked at the Mac Pro, and it was like 12 grand for the one that I was thinking I wanted. And I was like, that was a tough pill to swallow, especially since my income's kind of been up and down this year. But I was slow getting my client work done because I'd have to wait for it to run all the tests and stuff, and it would take forever. So I looked around, and DHH was recommending the Framework laptop. And I thought, oh, that looks nice. But again, I had decided that the laptop was probably not going to give me the horsepower I wanted. And so the folks on there, and I don't know if he recommended it or somebody else did, but they were all talking about a computer company called System 76. And so I ordered from them. It did take a bit of time because they custom build the desktop and then send it to you. But this one cost me like $3,300 instead of $12,000. And so that's what I am running on right now, and it's been terrific. I've had to adjust to running on Linux instead of on Mac, but I've been pretty happy with it. I know other people do work on Windows. I don't know. I've kind of gotten let me put it this way. So my wife and my mother-in-law and everybody else, right, that's not a tech person that I know, runs on Windows, and I just get tired of the maintenance hassle that I run into on Windows. And the other thing is that you have to run it through, all the stuff that I do. I typically wind up running through the Linux emulator system that they have built into Windows, which works okay, right? I don't hate it. But it was just like, or I could just run everything on Linux because that's how I'm running my life anyway, right? I mean, all my code deploys to Linux. And so, yeah, I've been very, very happy with it. It does essentially everything that I want it to. The only things I've run into that it can't do is you'll notice that I have the green screen set up behind me. If I want to run the green screen, I kind of have finagled things so that I can run the management software for the video mixer on Wine, but it still doesn't quite work the same as it does on the Mac. So I may just wind up doing all my streaming and recording on my Mac. And then, because I still have my MacBook Pro, but I won't run all the other heavy duty stuff. And then if I get in a pinch, GIMP and stuff work fine for the image editing and stuff, but I have the Adobe tools on my MacBook Pro, and so I'll run that there too. But I mean, everything else, it's just been and it's such a terrific dev environment. I can't say enough good things. So System 76 is my last pick. Bob, do you have some picks for us?
Well, I thought I'd jump into some science fiction books since that's my genre. And we had talked about The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. There is an alternate reality version of that story. And the name of the book is The Powers of the Earth. And it's written by Travis Corcoran, if I remember correctly. And it's absolutely hysterical and dead serious at the same time. It is the story of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, but told in a very modern, meaning current day, political environment. So very funny in a number of ways, and very serious in a bunch of ways. So that's one book worth the read. There's actually two books in the series plus a bunch of short stories, all of them worth reading. Travis is a software developer, so there's tons of Easter eggs. If you're a programmer, tons of Easter eggs in there. And I think he's off in the Northeast somewhere, living on a farm or something now. Some programmers do that. Another book that's book series that I found great. This goes back about 5-6 years. Is the whole Bobiverse series by Dennis E. Taylor, I think it is. And this is, again, it's the story of a software developer, and I think Dennis Taylor is a software developer too. And it's the story of a software developer named Bob, who sells his company, makes a fortune, and the first thing he decides to do is sign a contract so that his head will be frozen in the case he dies, and he'll be reawakened in some future time. And he walks out of that, after signing the contract, he walks out of the door and gets hit by a car. And he wakes up as the brain of a spaceship. After that, everything gets very interesting. It's a great story, and it goes on for several books, some of which are just hysterical. And they're all very funny and ironic and marginally plausible. So that's a cool book. Marginally plausible is the way. Yeah. Okay. And then the last one is a new one, and the author's name is, I can't remember. The name of the book is Theft of Fire. And this book, I have been. Oh, Devin Erickson. Devin Erickson is the author. I've been a hard sci-fi guy for a long time, and I've been very disappointed with the late genre of sci-fi because there's not a lot of good hard sci-fi. If you know, Mars was a great story. Okay, yeah,
The Martian.
The Martian. Weir writes good stuff, but there's been a lot of kind of fluffy sci-fi. This one is great. It's just great. Good hard sci-fi. A great premise. Great characters. So I'm very, very excited about this book. I read the first, and he's supposedly in the midst of writing the second one, so I'm dying to get my hand on that. Theft of Fire by Devin Erickson. So my hope is that there's a rebirth in the hard sci-fi genre.
Nice. All right. Well, I am also just going to plug your book, We Programmers. It's on Amazon. You can go buy it right now.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, look forward to Clean Coders second edition. All right. Well, thanks, Bob. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. And
right.
Yeah, if you want to stick around for a minute, make sure we get everything uploaded.
Sure.
All right.